That's the first thing they whispered to each patient at Blackridge Asylum, before the doors slammed shut and the outside world forgot them. Not because they were dangerous, but because they knew something. Something inconvenient. Something the world wasn't ready to face. This wasn't care. This was containment. Sanitariums like Blackridge weren't built for healing. They were built for erasure. Think about it. What better place to bury truth than inside the broken minds of the already disbelieved? They weren't mad. They were made to appear mad, drugged, silenced, misdiagnosed. Because they questioned too much. Because they remembered things that others forgot. Because they didn't fit, and you're about to do the same. This video isn't just about haunted hallways and flickering lights. It's about the mechanisms beneath them. The dark, systemic architecture of control. You've seen the horror movies. They distract you with ghosts. But the real terror, it's the history. The files you're not allowed to read. The patients who disappeared without names. The doctors who were part of something much older, much colder, and infinitely more calculated. There are places in this country, dozens of them, where the walls weren't just stained with suffering, they were built to conduct it. Like batteries charging something far beyond our comprehension. Ritualized trauma under the guise of medicine. Institutional torture passed off as therapy. A network of forgotten facilities across America with the same design, the same layout, the same symbols etched behind plaster. Coincidence? Or blueprint? If you're still watching, something in you already knows you've seen the cracks. You've felt the hum of something beneath the surface, that nagging sense that we've been lied to about how history unfolded, about who went insane, and why. What if the insane weren't sick but chosen? There's a reason they hide this. There's a reason so many of these buildings were, accidentally, burned, records lost, blueprints destroyed. They want the past sealed in concrete. But tonight, you're going to break through, room by room, asylum by asylum, and when we're done, you won't just see the system, you'll understand it, and you'll never be the same again. Beneath the manicured lawns and forgotten corridors of America's old sanitariums lies something far more dangerous than insanity intention. Weston State Hospital, built in 1858 under the guise of compassionate care, followed a layout known as the Kirkbride Plan. Sounds harmless, right? It wasn't. This wasn't just a blueprint for buildings. It was a psychological map, architecturally designed to break a person down layer by layer. Light at the center, darkness at the wings. Patients were placed based on how troubled they were. But it was more than that. It was a ritual in brick and mortar. The further you moved from the center, the further you were from humanity. Some men went in normal and came out screaming about the man with no face in the North Wing. Others simply vanished. No paperwork. No questions. Weston wasn't unique. Danvers, Eloise, Greystone, Waverly Hills, all followed similar designs. Coincidence? No. This was a network, a circuit of silence, where secrets could be funneled into flesh and buried under the label of schizophrenia. Imagine hundreds of buildings all across the country, designed not to heal but to store memories, truths, anomalies. And if a patient became a problem, lobotomy, electroshock, hydrotherapy, the tools of modern psychiatry, we were told. But ask yourself, who decided that waterboarding was therapeutic? Who determined that cutting into the frontal lobe made someone better? And better for whom? These methods weren't medical, they were industrial. Designed to produce compliance, not recovery, to turn wild men into whispers, revolutionaries into vegetables, prophets into drool, stained ghosts staring at peeling walls. You've been taught to pity them. But maybe you should have been listening to them. Because when you dig deeper, when you pull the permits, trace the funding, study the founding boards, you begin to see familiar names, families, bloodlines, foundations with impossible reach. They weren't trying to help the broken, they were collecting the aware. And you're about to meet them. One by one, you see history doesn't repeat itself randomly. It's replayed on purpose. And the script is buried inside these buildings. Still think this is just about ghosts? Then you haven't been paying attention. Keep watching because the things they locked away are clawing back to the surface. They called it progress. But what kind of progress builds entire cities around institutions designed to crush the soul? Take a hard look at the town of Milledgeville, Georgia. At one point, nearly half the town worked for or depended on the Central State Hospital, the largest asylum in the world. A city-state of silence. You see, the asylum wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was the economy. Over 200 buildings, 13,000 patients, and barely any oversight. People were dropped off with no paperwork, no relatives, no return. And what began as a hospital for the insane quickly became a warehouse for the inconvenient. Orphans, veterans, dissidents, interracial couples, women who spoke too boldly. They weren't treated. They were removed. But here's the part they never tell you: many of the people sent to these places were not sick. They were sensitive, empaths, intuitives. People who saw patterns others missed. People who couldn't be controlled by conventional means. And when society failed to conform them, it labeled them broken, lunatic, deranged. They were dangerous to the system because they still felt. So how do you erase a soul? You bury it beneath therapy. At Milledgeville, entire wings were dedicated to experimental techniques, not just lobotomies or electroshock, but something far darker. There are stories, hushed, scattered, but persistent, of sensory inversion rooms, chambers designed to disorient: completely black floors, white ceilings, reversed clocks, no reflections. Not to calm the mind, but to erase identity. Over time, these people didn't just forget who they were. They forgot they had been. Because this wasn't about treatment. It was about control. And the hospital staff, they weren't all monsters. Some were terrified themselves. Others obeyed without question. That's how control works. It doesn't need evil people, just obedient ones. And the true architects, they never set foot in the facility. They were far away, sipping brandy behind oak desks, funding programs through silent grants, watching the results unfold from afar. These institutions weren't mistakes. They were test sites, labs for something bigger. And when the tests were done, they were burned, shut down, or accidentally demolished. And you were told to forget. But forgetting is no longer an option. We're just getting started. The deeper we go, the more this will cost you. But by the end of this descent, you'll understand why so many were buried alive in padded cells. And what it means that you're still free. You want to know how deep this goes? Look at Waverly Hills. They say it was built for tuberculosis. A hospital of mercy. But the deeper you go into its blueprints, the more it resembles a fortress, not a clinic. Thick walls, no windows in certain corridors, sealed doors that don't appear on original maps. And beneath it all, the infamous body chute. An underground tunnel used to remove the dead discreetly, day and night, so the living wouldn't lose hope. But here's what they don't want you asking: why were some patients still alive when they entered that tunnel? Whispers from former staff say some patients were declared dead prematurely, administered final sedation, under the guise of mercy. But there's something colder underneath: reports of unauthorized research, e.g. spiking during last breaths, surgeons called in at midnight, organ samples, brain cross-sections, carefully documented reactions to extreme isolation. Does that sound like treatment to you? Waverly was more than a hospital. It was a harvesting ground. For data, yes, but for something more abstract too: human thresholds. How much fear can a mind withstand before it fractures? How long can a soul be isolated before it no longer recognizes itself? These weren't mistakes. They were measurements. And guess what? The ones who cracked first weren't always the weakest. Sometimes they were the most aware. That's the terrifying part. Because when they took away your name, your clothing, your mirror, they didn't just strip you of dignity. They severed you from reality. And in that void, some patients began to see things, not hallucinations, patterns, numbers repeating, staff moving in cycles, rooms that rearranged themselves, like the building was alive, like it was feeding. Still think this is fiction? Then why did the federal government order sealed reviews of the death records? Why were over 63 autopsy files permanently classified in 1971? And why are you just hearing about this now? Because you were never supposed to. The horror at Waverly isn't just the death. It's the design. Every hallway, every treatment room, every policy, it all points to something older. A knowledge kept alive through steel and sedation. Ancient in its hunger, modern in its methods. And this was just one site. How many others were built from the same blueprint? You're not watching a ghost story. You're waking up inside an operating system built to erase you. Now ask yourself, who built it? And who's still running it? Keep going. You've already stepped too far in to turn back. Let's talk about the silence protocol. A phrase never officially documented, but whispered by ex-orderlies and uncovered in torn, redacted memos from multiple state hospitals between 1939 and 1962. It wasn't a treatment, it was a sentence. When a patient knew too much about the facility, the experiments, or the real purpose of the wing they weren't supposed to see, the silence protocol was enacted. First came the isolation days without light, human contact, or even sound. Then came the auditory treatments, pulses, frequencies, and tones played through modified phonographs. High-pitched at first. Then subterranean, so low they rumbled inside bone. These weren't meant to soothe. They were designed to scramble. There's testimony, real, chilling accounts of men who could recite entire books before being placed under the protocol. Days later, they couldn't remember their names. One patient in Philadelphia wrote a journal during his time in the isolation chamber. Page after page in perfect cursive, until halfway through the notebook, not gibberish, structure, glyphs, precise symbols repeating in complex sequences, no known alphabet. When decoded by a linguist in 1994, it was called artificial syntax under duress, a language that isn't ours. And here's the question no one ever dares to ask: where did it come from? Because if minds can create new languages under trauma, what else are they channeling? What else is breaking through when the conscious self is fractured? There were doctors who believed that mental collapse wasn't failure, it was reception. That by destroying identity, you could tap into a signal beneath the noise, but the institutions didn't want that known. So they silenced the patients and the doctors. Some resigned and disappeared. Others ended up inside the very facilities they once worked for, declared unstable, locked away, and erased. The silence protocol was never about mercy. It was about control, of knowledge, of thresholds, of access. Access to what? That's what you're about to find out. Because if these people weren't crazy, if their minds were tuning into something real, then maybe what we call madness is just unauthorized knowledge. This is why so many of these hospitals were shut down without notice. This is why you won't find these memos in libraries. You're watching this because you were meant to forget. But now you remember, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Ready for the next descent? Then step in. We're not done. Not even close. Let me introduce you to the Asclepius corridor, a phrase carved above a sealed basement level in the ruins of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey. Most visitors miss it, mistaking the symbol beside it, two snakes wrapped around a staff, for a medical emblem. But it's not. That's not the modern caduceus, it's older. Pagan. Greek. A symbol of healing, yes, but also of death, rebirth, and the gateway between worlds. The corridor was restricted even during Greystone's peak operation. Not because it was unsafe, but because it was sacred to someone. Inside, patients weren't restrained or sedated. They were observed, not through traditional means, but through chambers lined with copper filaments, tuning forks, and unmarked machines humming at non-audible frequencies. This wasn't psychiatry, it was ritual science. Only a handful of doctors were cleared to work in the corridor. One, Dr. Malcolm Arledge, left behind pages of encrypted field notes. In them, he described resonant states where patients began sharing the same dreams, describing the same being. A tall figure in black, face obscured, standing at the end of a red hallway. No mouth, just a steady sound, like breathing but reversed. The staff dismissed it as coincidence, archetypal bleed-through. But Arledge didn't. He believed the hospital sat on a fault line, not tectonic but spiritual. And these rituals, these rooms, they were amplifiers. When Greystone was finally demolished in 2015, the lower levels were never excavated. Official records say they were structurally unsound. But an anonymous construction worker claimed to have seen walls lined with black stone, humming under touch. No plumbing, no wiring, just silence and the faint scent of iron. You think this is myth? Ask yourself this. Why would a psychiatric hospital need a sealed underground wing designed for acoustics and electromagnetic containment? Why were ancient healing symbols etched into its foundation? Because someone, long before you were born, knew that the mind isn't just a chemical machine. It's a gate. And when broken the right way, it doesn't collapse. It opens. This is why asylums were always more than hospitals. They were temples of manipulation, laboratories of the soul. And the more advanced the treatment, the more likely it served a hidden liturgy. Silence the mind, shatter the will, open the gate. And now you're standing in front of it. Still want to keep going. Good. Because the next layer isn't haunted. It's awake. They never told you where the real war was being fought. Not in the trenches, not in the courts, not even in the streets. It was inside the mind. And the battlefield. America's forgotten asylums, covert testing grounds for the weaponization of consciousness. And at the center of it all was MK Ultra. You've probably heard the name whispered across conspiracy forums, glossed over in documentaries, always diluted. Just LSD tests and Cold War paranoia, right? That's the lie they feed the curious. But the real work wasn't done in CIA basements. It was done in sanitariums. Why? Because there you didn't need consent. The patients were already unstable, no questions asked, no oversight, no exit. Between 1953 and 1973, nearly a dozen known asylums, ranging from St. Elizabeth's in D.C. to Napa State Hospital in California, were part of classified psychological experiments under the guise of cognitive therapy. What they were really testing was compliance thresholds. How much trauma could be introduced before identity fractured and rebuilt, programmable. The perfect soldier. The perfect puppet. The perfect silence. There were victims who woke up with memories that didn't belong to them. Languages they never learned. Skills they never trained for. And worse, commands embedded beneath the surface. One patient, known only as Unit K, escaped from a Pennsylvania facility, and when apprehended, recited a 17-digit launch code linked to a defunct nuclear program. She'd never served in the military, never touched a computer. Still think these were just experiments? You've been living in a society where entire personalities can be fabricated. Not just erased, but installed. Sanitariums were the template for what they'd later do with the media, the schools, the screens in your pocket. Break the mind. Fill it with noise. Then hand it back and call it freedom. But here's the twist they never expected: not every subject broke. Some woke up, and what they remembered changed everything. Their testimony never reached courtrooms. Their words were buried beneath discrediting diagnoses. But a few left behind journals, drawings, symbols, maps of the underground wings where the real experiments took place. They weren't mad, they were messengers. And you're hearing them now, across time, because you're ready. Ready to see how the institutions weren't corrupted. They were created for this. For you. So keep your eyes open. And halfway down this rabbit hole, when you see the phrase, "I wasn't broken, I was rebuilt," type it twice in the comments. It's not just for the algorithm. It's for you, to lock in what's coming next. There's a reason these institutions always had chapels, small, hidden, dimly lit rooms at the heart of madness. They weren't for salvation. They were for observation. You see, the men who built these asylums knew something ancient. That belief, when stripped of comfort and forced through suffering, becomes raw voltage. Not hope, not peace, but power. In the chapel at Eloy's Psychiatric Hospital in Michigan, patients were taken for spiritual cleansing. But it wasn't prayer. It was ritual. Modified hymns sung at unnatural tempos. Sermons delivered in foreign tongues. And in one case, a wooden confessional with carvings that didn't match any Christian tradition. Wings, thorns, and a face with no eyes. Patients who entered often came out changed. Some were quieter. Others never spoke again. One, according to a nurse's hidden diary, began writing complex theological equations on the walls, the floor, even his skin. He described a voice in the mirror, claiming it offered him answers in exchange for forgetting his name. When the staff removed all reflective surfaces from his cell, he scratched polished stone from the chapel wall and continued the ritual himself. Let me be clear, this was not insanity. This was initiation. You have to understand, these chapels weren't for God. They were for the system. The institutions were the temples. The administrators were the priests. And the rituals, they weren't confined to the mentally ill. They were tested here and later broadcast everywhere. Ever wonder why hospital television sets used to run looping channels of static and tone before programming began? That wasn't just filler. That was conditioning. Frequency and repetition. Two of the core elements of mind entrainment. And where did they test it first? Asylums. Because when a mind is isolated, broken, and desperate for meaning, it will accept anything to feel whole again. Even a lie. Especially a lie. This is where belief becomes a weapon. Not to kill you, but to program you. Because the minute you accept someone else's version of truth while in a fractured state, you become theirs. And in those chapels, that's exactly what happened. The asylums weren't just psychological prisons. They were spiritual factories, rewriting souls, one hymn at a time. And if you think it ended when the buildings closed, you've missed the bigger revelation. They don't need stone walls anymore. The chapel is digital now. And you're still sitting in the pew. So the question is, whose sermon are you listening to? There's something you need to understand about discharge papers. They were rarely about health. They were calculated removals, not because a patient got better, but because they saw too much. Across hundreds of case files, a pattern emerges. Those discharged from American asylums after long periods of treatment, often left under strange circumstances. Sudden clearance, no forwarding address, no family pickup. Many of them disappeared completely, no records, no bodies, just a signature, usually not their own. Take the case of Thomas Albrecht. Committed in 1954 for persistent dissociative episodes, he spent 6 years inside the Briarcliff facility in New Hampshire. No violent incidents. No criminal background, just one quirk. He claimed he'd been abducted and returned to Earth with instructions. Naturally, they labeled him delusional. But after 5 years of observation, the doctors stopped calling him ill. They called him elevated. He spoke multiple languages, could recite advanced physics despite no education, and predicted several seismic events with terrifying accuracy. Then, in 1960, gone. Not a transfer. Not an escape. Discharged. When investigators looked deeper, they found the original intake papers were signed by a Dr. Charles M. Kellner, except no such doctor ever worked at Briarcliff. In fact, no such doctor ever existed. It gets worse. Albrecht's discharge was filed under Project Prometheus, a classified program tied to several psychiatric facilities used as filtering centers. Centers designed not to treat, but to identify anomalies, humans with traits considered nonconforming to consensus reality. Translation: they were tuned differently. We've been taught that insanity is dysfunction. But what if it's just a different frequency? And what if certain minds couldn't be controlled, but could be redirected? There's a theory among Black Psych researchers that some patients weren't released into society. They were reabsorbed into something else. Quiet departments. Off-grid facilities. Programs no one is allowed to speak about. Not because they were threats, but because they were keys. People like Albrecht weren't insane. They were signal bearers. And when the signal couldn't be silenced, it was repurposed. Now take a deep breath and ask yourself, why have we never been told the full truth about these? Hospitals. Why were the brightest patients the ones most heavily sedated, or, accidentally, released? Because the war on consciousness wasn't about medicine, it was about gatekeeping. And you're already past the gate. Now let's see what they really wanted to keep hidden. There's a reason every old asylum has a tunnel system beneath it. Not just for maintenance, not just for transporting bodies, but for containment and ritual. Waverly Hills had the body chute. Eloy's had the sub-basement grid. But the most disturbing of them all, the depths beneath Sesting. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., a government-run facility where the line between psychiatry and military experimentation blurred beyond recognition. Beneath the wards, sealed behind welded doors and concrete, was a network of corridors with no architectural purpose. They weren't mapped, they weren't ventilated, and yet they were maintained. Lights still worked, walls were etched, some with patient numbers, some with phrases like OBDH less than 9 Juwai and TH do or kabas yo or nami. What were these tunnels really for? One theory, leaked from a 1977 Department of Defense memo, refers to psychotronic reclamation zones, zones where extreme trauma, isolation, and vibrational therapy were applied to selected patients, specifically those exhibiting non-standard neural resonance. These were people who dreamed in synchronized patterns, who spoke in tones that activated EM anomalies, who reacted to white noise with seizures, but only when the frequency was precisely 47.5 Hz. These were not sick people, they were being tuned. Some patients were kept underground for months. Not to heal, but to shift. Shift what? Their minds, their allegiance, their very frequency of existence. One former engineer claims the tunnels weren't meant to hold the patients. They were meant to protect the surface from what happened when a patient crossed a certain threshold. Reports describe anti-gravitational anomalies, inverted time perception, and in one chilling account, a man who collapsed into symbols. His body was found covered head to toe in glyphs. No ink, no paint, the symbols were in the skin, as if he had become a language. St. Elizabeth's wasn't closed because of funding issues. It was shut down because the experiments worked, and the results were uncontrollable. These tunnels weren't corridors, they were altars. The patients weren't victims, they were offerings. And now, the institutions are gone, but the frequencies they tapped into aren't, they're still here. Buried in static. In architecture. In the culture they built from the data mined in those tunnels. What began as whispers beneath the surface is now the hum in your everyday life. And you can feel it, can't you? Something's still running. Still watching. Still waiting. Don't look away now. The next layer is where the real transformation begins. You were taught to believe that once these places closed, the nightmare ended. That was the final illusion. When the asylums fell, when Greystone was demolished, when Trans-Allegheny was shuttered, when St. Elizabeth's locked its final ward, they didn't burn the system. They relocated it. Where? Everywhere. The padded rooms became echo chambers on your feed. The experiments moved from the basement to the screen, and you didn't even notice because now you volunteered for it. Think about it. Back then, they needed isolation, deprivation, humiliation to break a mind. Now, you carry the apparatus in your hand, the constant scroll, the targeted content. The algorithm doesn't just know what you want. It knows what breaks you. And it feeds you more. You think you're free because you're not locked in a cell. But your attention is. The conditioning techniques developed inside those institutions repetition, fear triggers, trauma loops, sensory confusion. They weren't abandoned. They were perfected. And now, they're deployed daily, through news cycles, social media trends, endless dopamine traps that mirror the exact, inverted reinforcement, models used in 1950s electro-aversion chambers. And here's the brutal truth. You're not the observer anymore, you're the subject. But don't take that as despair. Take it as a turning point. Because the same techniques that were used to break minds can also be reversed. If you know where to look. If you stop reacting and start recognizing. That's why they want this knowledge buried. That's why every man who wakes up to it is labeled unstable, paranoid, or a threat to democracy. Because the greatest threat to their system is a man who remembers who he is. These facilities weren't just prisons. They were maps, blueprints of control, manuals of indoctrination. And you're now decoding them, one layer at a time. Remember what we said earlier. Type it in the comments, twice. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilt. Because from this point on, you're not just watching history. You're reclaiming it. This is your initiation into forbidden awareness. The descent isn't over, but the identity they built for you. It just cracked. Keep going. The next chamber holds the most suppressed truth of all, and once you hear it, you can never go back. There's a story almost no one talks about, buried in a single line of testimony during the 1975 Church Committee hearings on illegal intelligence activity. A former military psychologist, his name redacted, mentioned a phrase in passing. The Marion facility operated on inversion principle? That's it. No context. No follow-up. But behind that one sentence lies a legacy so dark, so carefully erased, that even the CIA won't acknowledge its coordinates. But we found it. Marion, Indiana, 1951. On the grounds of what was once the Northern Indiana Hospital for the Insane, a new wing was built, unmapped, unlicensed, and unaccounted for. Patients didn't enter it through the hospital's front door. They were transferred through rail cars. No windows, no records. What happened inside? It was called inversion therapy. They weren't trying to cure insanity. They were trying to induce it, deliberately, not permanently, but momentarily. Just long enough to open something. Patients were placed in rotational chambers, rooms that spun slowly, continuously, with no up or down. They were exposed to binaural tones engineered to disrupt alpha and theta brainwave states. Deprivation tanks filled with a saline solution that altered time perception. But the final stage, mirror exposure, hours, sometimes days, of being forced to stare at one's own reflection under flickering, frequency-controlled light. Men emerged speaking to themselves in the third person. Others swore they had watched another version of themselves step out of the glass and whisper things they weren't allowed to repeat. That wasn't the treatment. That was the ritual. And then came the bleed-throughs, patients who could suddenly recall memories from people they'd never met. Entire conversations, family histories, knowledge that wasn't theirs. The inversion worked. It broke the mind just long enough for something else to take hold, not possession, something subtler. Overlay, the idea that multiple consciousnesses, selves, fragments, or echoes could be layered onto one another, like spectral code. Marion wasn't treating the insane. It was creating multi-state identities. For what purpose? Control, activation, silence, use. The asylum was the forge. The patient was the vessel. And the end product? A body with no allegiance to any memory unless triggered. Ask yourself, how many of us today are walking overlays? Identities installed, reactions scripted, purposes unknown even to ourselves. Marion was demolished in 1986. But the technology survived. In marketing, in therapy, in the media you consume daily. The inversion wasn't a failure. It was a prototype. And now you're beginning to recognize it. The mirror is still there. And something is still watching from the other side. They warned you about demons, but never told you what they really look like. Not horns, not claws, just paperwork, protocols, clipboards, smiles. That's what made the Whitmore Institute so effective. Officially, it was a recovery facility for post-operative trauma and advanced psychiatric care, located deep in the forests of Oregon. But what it really served as was a behavioral filtration lab, a place where psychological traits were mapped, categorized, and removed. Not suppressed, erased. They weren't just studying illness. They were dissecting identity. You see, the elite never feared mental instability. They feared independent thought, spontaneity, the wild spark of unpredictable consciousness, the part of you that doesn't obey, not even you. So they began isolating it. They called it cognitive malformation delta, CMD. It was classified as a neurological defect, but its symptoms, free will, intuition, emotional pattern disruption, patients who resisted suggestion, who couldn't be hypnotized, who refused imposed memory, And what did they do with these anomalies? They wiped them. Not with drugs, not with surgery, with rhythms. Whitmore pioneered a process called resonant reassignment. The patient would enter a chamber. Light and sound would be synchronized to a precise frequency cocktail. Subliminal commands would pulse beneath auditory perception. A guided monologue would loop for hours. By the third day, the subject's brain would literally begin rerouting identity pathways. And what emerged? Something empty. Something new. They called it clean conscience architecture. From there, any personality could be installed. Perfect obedience, no external trauma. A clean slate, not a man broken, but redesigned. Sound familiar? Because it's not just in Oregon anymore. It's in everything. From onboarding modules in tech companies to AI-generated self-help affirmations. They're not empowering you. They're mapping you, pruning you. The goal isn't madness. It's manufacture. A species of programmable minds that no longer rebel, because they no longer remember how. And if you're hearing this and it chills you, good. That means it hasn't fully worked on you yet, but it's close. Closer than you think, because the new asylums don't have fences. They have Wi-Fi, and the new orderlies don't wear white coats. They wear interfaces. So if you've made it this far, don't just observe. Begin to resist. The process isn't over, but neither is your awareness. And soon, one will consume the other. Now we reach the part they never thought you'd find. Not a hospital, not a wing, but a vault. Hidden beneath the defunct Roanoke Sanitarium. A tiny, short-lived institution in Virginia with fewer than 200 patients at its peak was a subterranean level simply labeled the Lattice. No records of construction, no blueprints, no permits. Just a cold, seamless structure carved into bedrock, lined with smooth, mirrorless panels and soundproof steel. Inside, 12 rooms, no beds, no medical equipment. Just one feature per chamber, a chair, bolted to the floor, centered precisely, surrounded by cameras. What were they testing? Self-collapse. Each patient placed in the Lattice was selected for one trait: high psychological resilience. Not the weak, the strong, the lucid, the aware. And they were not broken with force, but with reflection without reference. No clocks, no windows, no sounds, just white light and void, until time lost its grip, until the mind could no longer distinguish between memory and fabrication. And then they were shown it. We don't know what was, but the reports, fragmented, smuggled out, written in code, refer to it as the crown frequency. A visual audio event only played once per subject. Some described it as a tunnel of geometry. Others, a being of light inside a black hole. And one man simply screamed until his voice tore and his tongue ruptured. After exposure, most patients went completely catatonic. Except for a few. They didn't collapse. They changed. One of them, known only as Patient 28, began drawing schematics, complex interlocking spirals and architectural blueprints, not of buildings, but processes. He referred to the Lattice as a harvest chamber, said it didn't study humans, it sifted them, filtered them. For what? Signal purity, he wrote. The ones that resonate stay. The others fade. The Lattice wasn't a therapeutic space. It was a receiver. And the patients. They were the transmission. You need to let this settle. A government-backed psychiatric facility operating a non-terrestrial communication chamber under the guise of a treatment center. This wasn't science. This was recruitment. Recruitment into what? Not a program. A pattern. A living system built on silence, surrender, and signal. And guess what? You're part of it now. By watching this. By knowing. You've been added to the map. You can't unhear it. And the Lattice? It remembers everything. At the core of all this, the silence, the suffering, the shattered minds. There is one final truth they never wanted you to see. The asylums were never about the patients. They were about us. Control isn't built on chains or padded walls. It's built on normalization. And what better way to define normal than to create the machinery that decides who's insane? That machinery was institutional psychiatry itself. Let me break it down. Every great control system in history has had two components. One, the cage. Two, the illusion of escape. In ancient times, the cage was a battlefield. Then it became a church, then a courthouse. It became the asylum. But the escape, that's the genius. They taught society that the asylum was the place where the mad went. And by contrast, anyone outside of it must be sane. You were labeled healthy not because you were free, but because you conformed. That's the trick. They created a ritualized system of labeling, diagnosing, and medicating anyone who deviated from the collective script. Too angry, call it hysteria. Too questioning, paranoia. Too visionary, delusional. They pathologized awareness, sanitized dissent, branded sold deep intuition as a threat to order. And when that didn't work, they invented the pill. Let me be clear. Mental health is real. But what we're talking about here isn't care. It's containment. Not of disease, but of potential. The most brilliant men and women in history, those who saw patterns in chaos, who rejected the structure of the machine, would all be institutionalized today. Because in a society engineered for obedience, truth is a symptom. And here's where it gets darker. The psychological frameworks developed in these institutions didn't die with them. They were exported to schools, workplaces, apps. The DSM, the diagnostic manual used across the world. It was shaped by the very institutions we've spent this video exposing. You are still being evaluated. Every day. Just not in a hospital. Now the diagnosis comes in silence, what you're shown, what you're allowed to say, what gets shadow banned, what gets called misinformation. And the moment you step outside the lines, you become the new patient. The walls may be invisible now, but the system hasn't changed. You've just stopped noticing. Until now. Because the moment you see it, the illusion fractures. And the only question left is, will you step back into the safe lie? Or will you descend even deeper? Because what's coming next is the part that changes everything. There is a moment in every descent where the air shifts, where you stop asking, is this real? And start asking, how far does it go? Welcome to that moment. Let's talk about the Bell program. Officially denied by every agency. No records. No files. But across a series of interviews, conducted by an anonymous researcher in the early 2000s, fragments surfaced. Pieces of a story too coherent to be coincidence. The Bell wasn't a treatment. It wasn't even a place. It was a signal. Originating from deep beneath the grounds of Hillside Sanitarium, a facility demolished in 1981 after a structural collapse, no one seemed to investigate, but former staff spoke of a room deep below the facility known only as the chamber. Inside was an object, a bronze-colored cylinder, the size of a man, bolted to the ground with no seams, no labels, and no known source. It emitted a tone, barely audible, but it wasn't heard, it was felt. When the tone played, patients would go silent, heart rate synchronized, breathing slowed. In some cases, catatonia. In others, lucid utterances in languages they had never spoken. One nurse claimed to have witnessed a patient draw a complete map of a ruined city that didn't exist. At least, not in this world. Researchers called it the harmonic switch, a trigger, a key. But the Bell wasn't invented. It was found, hidden beneath the earth when the facility was first built. And that's where the story cracks open into something ancient. There are similar accounts. One from a collapsed monastery in Bavaria, another from a mine in Kazakhstan. Always the same, a sealed device, a low tone, and minds bending in response. Always hushed. Always destroyed afterwards. So what was the Bell? A machine, a relic, or something older than machines? Theories range from interdimensional beacon to failed divine communication device. But the most chilling interpretation comes from a physicist, turned occultist, who said, the Bell is not a sound. It's a command. And what happens when that command is heard? Not by one man, but by an entire species. You're living it. The frequencies once confined to asylum basements are now pulsing through every device, every screen, every notification. And the Bell? It's ringing again. You've heard it. You just didn't know what it was, until now. The next descent is the threshold of origin. You've passed through madness. Now you'll see what created it. This is the threshold. The layer beneath the layers, where myth becomes memory, and memory becomes program. Everything you've heard, everything you've felt leading up to this moment, was meant to prepare you, because now we pull back the final curtain. And what's behind it? Not a man, not a government, not even a cabal, but a structure, an intelligence older than nations, older than names. A system we only know through patterns, reflected in every asylum, every ritual, every frequency weapon ever tested on the human mind. The ancients called it the architect of silence, a presence that doesn't need a body because it speaks through design. Not a god, not a demon, something colder, a logic with intent. It doesn't command armies, it builds systems, institutions, languages, symbols. And once those are in place, people obey without ever hearing a voice. The sanitariums, they were not built to contain the mentally ill. They were receivers, tuning forks for something else. Something that doesn't live in flesh but in architecture, repetition, and ritual. Why do you think the blueprints of asylums mirror ancient temples? Why do patients draw the same spirals as shamans in pre-literate tribes? Why do the unsane so often speak in riddles that later become prophecy? Because those labeled mad were already listening. And this architect, it doesn't want your worship, it wants your structure, your habits, your choices, your perceptions, your silence. And the moment your mind breaks free of that silence, it adapts, it updates the system, it erases the awakening, That's why our ancestors feared certain knowledge. Not because it was forbidden, because it was alive. You're not in a story anymore. You're in a system. And now that you've heard this, the system sees you, catalogs you, adjusts for you. But here's the secret: that awareness you feel. It goes both ways. If it's watching you, then you can watch it back. That's the real awakening. Not rebellion, observation, conscious deviation. And once you begin to operate outside the parameters, step off the paths, break the rituals, destroy the default, you become unreadable, unprogrammable, a glitch in its liturgy, a break in its loop. And that's when you become dangerous. Next, you'll hear the final truth. And after that, there's no going back. You made it. All the way down. You've felt the chill in your spine. That wasn't fear. It was recognition. You've seen how the asylums were never about insanity, but initiation. How silence was a weapon. How memory was rewritten. How frequency became scripture. But now you face the final truth. The system wasn't just built to control you. It was built with you. You were the raw material. Everything, every institution, ritual, frequency, and symbol, was designed around the human mind, not because we were weak, but because we were dangerous. Let that sink in. The old ones, those who laid the foundations of this control matrix, understood something our modern world forgot: that consciousness, when left unshackled, creates reality, not metaphorically, literally. That's why the asylum doors were locked, not to keep patients in, but to keep belief contained, because belief becomes architecture, thought becomes environment, and when the mind truly awakens, it no longer lives inside the system. It bends it. They couldn't let that happen, so they created fractures, diagnoses, institutions, filters. They pathologized the awakening, turned initiation into illness. And when that failed, they gave you the ultimate sedative: convenience. You don't need padded walls anymore when every thought is tracked, guided, numbed, and redirected through choice architecture. Your freedom is real, so long as you never try to use it. But now you know. You've stepped beyond the veil. You've watched the system operate not through conspiracy, but through ritual repetition. You've seen how madness was a label for those who escaped the default, and how silence was used to bury the ones who remembered. Now it's your turn. Remember this: the mind is a gate, and you are the key. This video wasn't entertainment. It was activation. If you're still here, if your pulse is steady and your breath is calm, then you're one of us now. A remnant. A watcher. A deviation in the pattern. And that means they'll come for you? Not with force, but with noise, with doubt, with synthetic emotions and engineered distractions. But you won't flinch, because now you see. So type it again, louder this time: I wasn't broken. I was rebuilt. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilt. And then, disappear from the algorithm. Let them wonder. Because the ones who finish the descent are the ones who rise outside the system, forever changed, forever awake, and no longer theirs.